I was 14 when I was murdered on December 6, 1973.
What happens when a deeply personal story about grief, trauma, and healing is reimagined as a supernatural thriller? The Lovely Bones novel was written in 2002 by Alice Sebold. The novel was originally created as an introspective novel about life after death, told by a murdered girl watching her family cope with loss. In 2009, The Lovely Bones was brought to screen by Peter Jackson, except it had become something completely different. Today we will be exploring how the Adaption story significantly alters in tone and focus, and how these changes shift the audience engagement with its themes of grief, justice, and the afterlife. To begin, the book The Lovely Bones takes place in 1973, following a 14-year-old girl, Susie Salmon, who was murdered by her neighbor, George Harvey. From her personalized in-between afterlife, she watches over her grieving family as they struggle to move forward. Her father, Jack, becomes obsessed with finding Susie's killer, whereas her mother, Abigail, distances herself emotionally and eventually leaves. Susie's younger sister, Lindsay, tries to move forward, dealing with the grief of her sister and the added stress of her parents' pain. Susie herself must come to terms with her own death and let go of the life she lost. Ray Singh is Susie's first crush and emotional tether to the living world. Ruth Connors is a classmate who becomes obsessed with the spiritual realm and forms a physical connection with Susie. These two characters are heavily connected to Susie spiritually and romantically. Together, they play a key role in Susie's brief return to Earth and emotional closure. When the film adaptation was released, the same basic premises followed. Susie is murdered and watches her family from the afterlife. However, director Peter Jackson emphasizes the supernatural and suspense aspects, transforming much of the story into a visually striking thriller. This led the tone, structure, and focus to shift significantly. The ethereal in-between is rendered in CGI landscapes, which, at times, takes away from the emotional intimacy. Jack's obsession and Lindsay's quiet strength remain prominent, but Abigail's emotional detachment and affair are underdeveloped. Many other characters, such as Ruth and Ray, also had reduced roles. Even George Harvey becomes more of a looming horror presence than a nuanced character. When comparing the book to the movie, the genre shift is a very striking difference. From an introspective literary fiction to a suspense-driven supernatural thriller. In the opening pages of the book, the murder to Susie Salmon has already been revealed, and the story is less concerned with what happened and rather how her loved ones lived through the aftermath. It's a quiet meditation on grief, guilt, healing, and the invisible ties between the living and the dead. In contrast, Jackson injects the story with a sense of urgency and danger by heightening the cat-and-mouse dynamic between Jack Salmon and George Harvey. The film builds tension through ominous music, dramatic lighting, and frequent close calls, as when Lindsay breaks into George's house, or when Jack confronts a neighborhood boy in the cornfield. Scenes that were more emotionally reflective in the book are turned into tension-induced set pieces, with thriller conventions like dramatic pacing, visual foreshadowing, and a menacing portrayal of Harvey that borders on horror. This tonal shift changes the viewer's focus. Rather than immersing us in the emotional complexity of loss, the film often asks us to anticipate the next moment of tension or justice. The question becomes, will Harvey ever get caught? Rather than, how does a family survive the unthinkable? While this may make the story more engaging for mainstream audiences, it also flattens the emotional depth and introspection that made the novel so resonant. Moving on, the in-between state is also deeply changed in the adaptation. In the novel, the in-between is a subtle, dreamlike space that reflects on Susie's inner emotions and evolving state of acceptance. It's deliberately vague, sometimes resembling a school, a field, or a comforting version of the real world. The ambiguity invites readers to focus not on spectacle, but on Susie's emotional journey, her longing for life, her struggle to let go, and her bittersweet love for those she left behind. Peter Jackson, as is known for his visual grandeur in The Lord of the Rings, reimagined this space as a CGI-heavy wonderland. Using CGI, Jackson created surreal landscapes, morphing environments, and literal fantastical metaphors. While visually striking, these sequences often feel more concerned with visual awe than emotional weight. The bright colors, dramatic weather changes, and symbolic imagery sometimes overwhelm rather than support the emotional tone. Instead of deepening our connection to Susie's grief and longing, the CGI sequences can feel distant, even alienating. The in-between should feel like an extension of Susie's soul. However, the more time we spend in this artificial dreamscape, the less grounded the story becomes. Instead, it often feels like a fantasy backdrop. We watch Susie wander through stunning digital vistas, but we feel less of her, her thoughts, her heartbreak, and her need for closure. The intimacy of her narration is visually drowned out by spectacle. As a result, viewers may come away impressed by visuals, but less connected to the heart of the narrative. One of the most significant changes in the film adaptation of The Lovely Bones is how it simplifies or sidelines several character arcs that are added as emotional complexity to the novel. These reductions don't just alter individual characters, they change the emotional balance of the entire story. In the book, Abigail Salmon has an affair with Detective Len Fennerman. This affair is not just a plot point. It's a window into the crushing weight of grief and how different people cope. Abigail's emotional withdrawal and eventual decision to leave her family speak to a deeper theme: the disintegration of indemnity under trauma. Her choice is painful, flawed, and human. The novel allows her to be a woman torn apart by not just the loss of her daughter, but by the suffocating expectations of motherhood and marriage. In the film, this arc is mostly erased. Abigail's affair is barely hinted at, and her departure from the family feels abrupt and unexplained. As a result, we lose a vital part of how grief fractures people in unpredictable and uncomfortable ways. Similarly, Ruth and Ray, who play crucial roles in Susie's spiritual and emotional closure, are dramatically reduced. In the novel, Ruth becomes a psychic medium of sorts, someone who senses the lingering presence of the dead and becomes obsessed with Susie's story. Ray, Susie's first love, holds deep symbolic meaning, representing the life Susie never got to live. Together, Ruth and Ray help facilitate one of the novel's most important moments: Susie's brief return to Earth, where she inhabits Ruth's body to share a single night of life, love, and physical connection with Ray. In the film, this moment still exists, but it feels rushed and underdeveloped due to the characters not being meaningfully built up. Without their emotional and spiritual significance, the scene feels less like a cathartic culmination and more like a strange narrative detour. Trimming these characters and their arcs simplifies the story of the Lovely Bones. It becomes more linear, more focused on solving a murder, and less about the messy, haunting ways people live with loss. It trades quiet complexity for narrative efficiency, and in doing so, it loses some of its soul. In the end, The Lovely Bones is not just a story about a murder. It's a story about the people left behind. It's about the messy, non-linear, and often silent ways grief unfolds across a family and a community. Alice Sebold's novel invites readers into that stillness, into the quiet ache of absence and the slow, imperfect process of healing. It doesn't promise justice or closure in the traditional sense. Instead, it offers something more honest, an exploration of how love, memory, and pain can exist all at once, and how people continue living even when a part of them is frozen in loss. Peter Jackson's adaptation, while beautifully shot and emotionally earnest in places, tells a different kind of story. It pulls the narration into the realm of visual spectacle and suspense. The grief remains, but it's stylized, often overshadowed by soaring CGI sequences and the mechanics of a thriller plot. The focus shifts from an internal reckoning to an external resolution. For some audiences, this may make the story more accessible or more dramatic, but in that transformation, something vital is lost: the subtle, layered, deeply human texture of Sebold's original work. Characters like Abigail, Ruth, and Ray are no longer given the space to breathe, evolve, or contradict themselves. Their emotional arcs are truncated or removed altogether, leaving behind a simpler version of events where catharsis is tied to whether the villain is caught, rather than how the survivors cope. Even Susie herself becomes more of an observer than a fully realized emotional presence. That's not to say the film is without merit. It captures moments of tenderness and fear, and in its best scenes, it still reflects some of the novel's soul. But as an adaptation, it ultimately reflects the choices of its medium and its creators. Where the book lingers in grief, unsure and unresolved, the film wants to move forward. Where the novel lets us sit with the discomfort of unhealed wounds, the adaptation hurries to stitch them up. And in doing so, it changes not only how the story is told, but what the story is.